Hey guys, and welcome to the section of cognition where we're going to talk about thinking and language. So, today's essential questions are: what are the structural components of language? What does language consist of? What does it mean for something to be a language? How do we acquire or how do we learn language? What's the critical period for a language and what does that mean? What does language, or how does language influence our cognition? That's a really interesting idea. And so, what you need to be able to do by the end of this is to discuss how the language we speak can influence our thinking and also discuss some of the core elements of a language and language production. So, let's get started. So, to start, I wanted to run by a cool idea I had for a sci fi movie. Basically, it's a sci-fi movie about aliens, and the idea I have is that they can communicate their ideas in between each other that they're having in their mind by sort of producing changes in the air pressure, by manipulating the air pressure that's in the air, which then the other aliens sort of sense with their special organs. And with those special organs, they can sort of understand what the other alien is thinking. So it's almost like telepathy, where they can sort of express what they're thinking in their minds by, using this air pressure. Um, anyway, I thought it was a pretty cool idea. But what's really weird is that this is not a sci-fi idea. This is just reality. This is how we communicate to each other. If you don't know how this works, basically the air that is coming out of my lungs right now is passing over the vocal cords in my throat, and those vocal cords are vibrating as the air goes over it, causing the air pressure to change essentially. And as it passes out over my tongues and my lips, again, I'm sort of manipulating the way that that air pressure is coming out. And so I'm really just creating different types of sound waves. I'm manipulating the air pressure of the air to create sound waves in the air, which travel into the microphone technically, and then out of your speaker, and that hits you in the ear. The air pressure changes are hitting you in the ear right now. Your ear vibrates, the inner ear vibrates because of those vibrations, and stimulates these tiny little hairs inside of your ear, which then turn that into an electrical signal, which then sends it to your brain, and your brain interprets it as language. So, kind of a ridiculous way of thinking about how my thoughts can be understood by you, simply because I'm manipulating air pressure, which your tiny little hairs in your ear can sense, and then you therefore understand what I'm thinking. Weird, right? But that's how it works. So, first of all, regardless of the way that we understand each other, what is it that makes a language in the first place? So, a language is something spoken, written, or signed that, when combined, the words have communicate meaning. So, regardless of how we are, understanding each other with language, what is a language in the first place? So, what makes something a language is that it is spoken, written, or signed words that, when combined, can communicate meaning. So, under this definition, I guess we could say that yes, animals do have language because they are able to communicate meaning with individual words. They don't combine them necessarily the way that we do, but there are examples like meerkats that live on the African savannas. They have certain calls that alert the other groups, the members of their group, to different types of predators. So one call alerts them to a predator in the sky. Like they can actually have a call that says, "Look up in the sky because there's something up there right now that we need to avoid, like an eagle or something," or a different call that indicates that it's a predator that's on the ground, like a snake perhaps. So they have these different words that essentially are communicate different meanings. So that is technically a language. Now, of course, language in humans is much more advanced, and it's really the idea that why did we become such a dominant species compared to the rest of the species that we see on this planet, and it's probably because of the language abilities that we have. One theory is that we had language before we had the cognition that we do. That it's because of the language that we built such strong and high-powered brains that we have today, capable of so many things. And it was because of language that sort of drove that cognition. But what is it about language that allows us to survive? Why would that have been a naturally adaptive trait? Wouldn't it have been better to grow bigger muscles or become faster? Like, why is it that we developed language, and how did that help us survive? Well, the idea is that it allows us to form very close social bonds with each other, and we are such social animals. And it's really this social ability that we have that allows us to thrive as a species and dominate, because it allows us to cooperate. If you put one human in a forest, the chances of them surviving are very slim. They'll probably die. They'll probably become food for the forest. But if you put 100 individuals into a forest, now they become the top predator, essentially, of that forest. And it's because of that cooperation that they're capable of working together. The other thing that's really important is that with language, we are allowed to pass on knowledge that I learn to the next generation. So we can learn from each other, even if, this knowledge was from 100 years ago. Before we even developed writing systems, which happened, about 5,000 years ago, we were still around walking on the planet for about 150,000 years as human beings in our full evolved forms, but we just didn't have written language yet. So, for 150,000 years, we were accumulating knowledge and passing it down through an oral tradition. Everything from how to manipulate fire to how to grow certain types of, I guess we weren't growing crops at that time, but where to find food, how to fashion tools so that we could catch that food and stuff like that. All of that is because of that oral tradition, that oral ability. In this case, we don't need to have the best memories in the world, because we're able to sort of depend on the memories of others, that other people know things that they can share with me, and then I know that too. So it sort of is this collective memory that allows us to dominate as well. Now, one of the interesting ideas about memory is that we gave up some of our memory abilities to be able to develop our language abilities. And that's shown in one of the famous experiments to talk about this idea of cognitive trade-off theory. So cognitive trade-off theory says that when you look at chimpanzees, they have a much more adept short-term working memory ability than humans do. That on these short-term or working memory tasks, such as looking at numbers for a short period of time and then memorizing the order of where they are in a computer screen, chimpanzees dominate humans in this relatively simple task, but at the same time, they're much better at this short-term or working memory task than humans are. And so why do they have a better short-term memory than us? And why did we not develop this? They have a cognitive ability that we literally don't. We think of ourselves as being the most cognitively advanced species on the planet, and we are for certain things. But in this task, we can see chimpanzees are dominant. So one of the ideas that whatever area of the brain that they're using for that, we, instead of using that area of the brain for that task or that type of memory, we've sort of altered our brains through evolution, and that we've traded off that ability to have that extremely high-powered short-term memory to be able to have language abilities, which the chimpanzees don't. So check out the video. It's a really cool video that talks about that. So what is language? Language is the structure of how we put together sounds, basically, right? So when we look at the basic small units of sound in a language, those are called the phonemes. So if you can remember phone means sound. So phonemes are the individual pieces of sounds that are capable of all the different ways that we can move our mouths and our lips to make different sounds. So if I said s, p, e, ch, those are 4 different phonemes. They're the individual units of sound, right? Now they don't mean anything. The sound s doesn't mean anything. The sound p doesn't mean anything. So they don't have any meaning to it. They're just sounds. But when I combine the sounds together, that's when I start having meaning, and that's what a morpheme is. So morpheme is when you morph it together. You morph together those individual sounds, and those individual sounds make up a unit that has an actual meaning to it. So they may be a word in itself, or it might be a part of another word, like prefixes or suffixes or things like that. So if I say the word speech, speech is one morpheme. I can't break that into different meanings, right? It has, like I said, it has four phonemes, s, p, e, ch, those are four phonemes, but put them together, and I have one morpheme. But if I look at the word bicycle, for example, it's one word, but technically it's two morphemes, because bi has its own meaning, which means two, and cycle has its meaning too, which means like wheel or round in this context, right? So it's got this ability for morphemes to become, multiple words, basically. I've got bicycle, I've got bifocals, all different types of ways of using those morphemes. Now, the language structure of what we think of the structure of a language, we sometimes think of the grammar. So the grammar is the system of rules that enables us to communicate really complex ideas. When we think of cavemen speaking, they don't have that grammar structure. They just use sort of these nouns and verbs without sort of the nuanced grammar that we think of as of what our language structure is. So the real idea of what grammar is two things. It's A, semantics, and B, syntax. Semantics is what the meaning of words are, or the use of the words. So when we talked about semantic memory, that's a little bit like confusing with this idea of what semantics is with grammar. So don't get it confused. We can understand semantics when we think semantics is what's the meaning of it. So it kind of relates to the idea of semantic memory, because semantic memory is like the information about what's the meaning of this word, like the semantics of the definitions of words. That's the semantic memory. Or semantic encoding, like looking at the meaning of things to understand it better. All of it means meaning, but in the context of grammar, it's how I use the word in context. And syntax is the order of the words that I use. So in the sentence below, you can see that both of the sentences are incorrect technically, but which one has incorrect syntax and which one has incorrect semantics? Well, the first one says, I don't talk English with good what? Now, if you think, well, we don't use the word talk when we say talk English. We don't talk languages, we speak languages. So I'm confusing the idea of talk and speak. When do I use talk and when do I use speak? And so this is a semantics problem. Like, the grammar is fine, technically. It's just the use of the word talk versus the use of the word speak that's not correct. So that's a semantics problem. Number two says, I win, speak, no, I have good. This is a problem with syntax. Instead of saying, when I speak, I don't have good syntax, that would be correct syntax. And so a lot of times when we think of how someone speaks, like Yoda from Star Wars, he has terrible syntax. So there are 40 different phonemes in the English language, 40 different individual sounds that we make with our mouths, which can be combined into over 100,000 morphemes. And those 100,000 morphemes, or individual units that have a meaning, can be combined in different ways to make 600,000 words total in the English language, which then can be combined to express literally an infinite amount of sentences and ideas. I mean, not literally, it's not infinite, but pretty extensive ability to make any thought that you want. And the chances of you saying something today that have never been said before in human history are pretty high because of the amount of variability that we have in our way to combine all of these ideas. So how do we acquire language in the first place? A man by the name of Noam Chomsky, you may or may not have heard of. He's a famous linguist, famous philosopher. Recently he talks a lot about politics. He came up with this idea that we have something called universal grammar. And universal grammar is basically stating that the grammar that we have, or the language that we have, is sort of built into us. That we have this predisposition for grammar and a predisposition for language from the day that we're born. What he means by this is that you're not born speaking English or Spanish, but what he's meaning is that you're hardwired neurologically with the structures of the brain to have the ability to learn language. That it's almost like the programming of the computer is in your brain. And then what you do with the program, whether you learn English with your program or whether you use Spanish with your program, it depends on your environment. But the fact of the matter is that you've got this hardwired program in your brain designed for language. And so he called it the language acquisition device. And there is some evidence to say that we are just born sort of ready and willing to learn language. And one of the things is when we look at people who have problems with language, and there's actually a genetic mutation that results in speech disorders. There's a famous family that has quite a few members of the family who are born with this genetic mutation that prevents them from being able to speak with grammar. They can use, basic languages almost like cavemen, like we talked about, just saying like go, park, and they can communicate that they want to go to the park, but they can't put together a full sentence with that grammar. And so there is something genetic going on. There does seem to be at least a gene that's partially in control of grammar. The other thing is that all languages have some commonalities, which is that they all have nouns, adjectives, and verbs. It doesn't matter what language you look at, they all have these very basic elements to them. And then another thing is that all humans are born speaking in the same way, that we all learn to speak with nouns first, that no baby learns to speak with verbs or adjectives. First we talk about the objects we see, then we talk about what we can do with those objects, and then we talk about how we do that with the adjectives. And then there's this idea of overgeneralization that we sometimes see with babies learning language, which is basically grammar mistakes. But it's the types of grammar mistakes that they're making that tend to make us believe that there's something that they're born with that's making them make that mistake. So when we look at the development of language, for the first 18 years of your life, from the day you're born until the day you graduate, you learn about 60,000 words. And so if you take an average, that's about 3,500 words a year and 10 each day. Now, obviously, as a senior, you're probably not learning 3,500 words this year or 10 a day. But if you think about the fact that you're not learning that many now, how many were you learning when you were just a child? As a toddler, you were probably learning, 40 to 50 words a day, and upwards of 10,000 a year as a 4 or 5 and 6 year old. So really impressive, the ability of a young child to pick up language. But how do we pick it up? So like most people learning a second language, babies are almost the same. We don't learn to speak first, we learn to understand first. And so that's called receptive language. We're receiving the language. And so this develops a lot quicker than our ability to produce the language. So we can see this with 4 months old and 6 months old. They already have these receptive language abilities developing, and pretty highly specialized as well. So 4 months old can actually recognize the differences in sounds and understand the mouth movements that go with that sound. So one study they did was they'd have a screen with two people making movements with their lips, and they would play a sound. And so the sound would be something like an O sound. And so the babies could recognize that sound O and which of those mouths was the correct one to look at. So when the mouth said O, they would look at that sound and the mouth saying O and ignore the other one that was maybe making a sound with the mouth, that is, right? And so they knew which mouth was correct for which sound at only 4 months old, and that's pretty impressive. They can also at 6 months start recognizing objects like nouns. So I remember my niece was about 8 months old, and she was crawling all over the place, and I told her she had some toys that were around on the other side of the couch, and I said, go get your pink dog. And out of all the toys back there, she knew which one I was talking about, and she went and got it and bring it back to me, and I was just shocked that she knew what I was talking about. She couldn't say the word pink dog, but she definitely knew what I was talking about, and that's a part of that receptive language. The productive language is where you produce it, so you're producing it. And technically at 4 months of age, we're not really speaking, but we're trying to speak. So we're doing something called the babbling stage. That, baby babble is stuff like ma, ba, ba, boo, 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 bee, bee. And they're really just practicing the sounds that they're going to be using later for their language. Now, these are called nonsense sounds. They're not really actually meaningful to the baby. And they're not copying what their parents are saying either. They're just practicing the possible phonemes with the mouth. And so when they say ma, 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 or pa, 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 you might want to believe that they're saying mom or dad, but they're really not. They're just practicing sounds. Just a coincidence. The other thing is that we know that they're not imitating is because all babies babble in the same way. It doesn't matter if you're born in Korea or Russia or the United States or Paraguay. All babies babble in the same universal babble language. So they're not copying their mother language. At about 10 months old, that's when we start seeing individual words come out. Of course, people are different. They might speak earlier or later, but that's when you see your first word. So the one-word stage is just expressing desires with one word. They can express more meaning in the way that they say that one word. So, for example, a child who's learning to speak might say, doggy, and point to the doggy. And they're obviously sort of saying, look at the dog, mom. So they understand this idea of communication, even though they're not able to put together a grammar of, hey, look at the mom, look at the dog. Now, at 18 months, that's where we see two-word stage. That's also called telegraphic stage. So it's basically putting a string of two words together. It's a verb-noun pair most of the time. So instead of saying just park, they can say go park, which means I want to go to the park, or drink milk, or I would like to drink some milk, please. So they can put together these very basic sentences of verb-noun pairs called telegraphic speech. At about age 3 is when we really start to see them branch out and start using more complex grammar structures. And they may even start to make incorrect guesses on new language. And this is where we can see this ability that they seem to be built for language and the mistakes that they're making. And one of the mistakes we see is overgeneralization. Overgeneralization is where they apply grammar rules that they've learned to other exceptions that are normally, they don't fit that rule. And so if you think of the languages, they have, certain rules. Like in the English language, if I want to say something in the past tense, I usually just add the word, or I add the letters ed. I add that morpheme on the end of the verb. Talked, right? Stopped, started, all of these things. And babies pick up on that, and they're like, okay, got it, that's the rule. And then they will apply it in incorrect places. And they'll say, we goed to the park yesterday. That's a really common overgeneralization that you'll see babies with, speaking English. They'll make that common mistake. And so they've learned that rule, and they don't question it, but then they apply it to new situations. And they say, oh, new verb? Okay, well, then I need to put on this ed on there. And they're wrong in doing that, but what's fascinating is that they know that they need to apply this rule to all verbs. No one has told them that. No one's given them grammar lessons. They just automatically know what is a verb, and I need to put an ed on the verb in the past tense. And so when they make that mistake, we recognize, wow, they're not just copying parents, because if they just copied the parents, then they wouldn't make that mistake. But again, they're not necessarily just copying our language. They're processing it. They are basically being creative with the language. And we see that with the mistakes that they make. But they're built for it. Overextension is another way that we see babies make mistakes. And this is very similar to overgeneralization, but it's not about grammar, it's about vocabulary. So using the vocabulary words that they know in an incorrect place. So making assumptions about the world. If this is this and that is similar to this, then that also must be this. So, for example, a baby that calls a towel a blanket, it's probably because they learned that anything soft that you put on your body is a blanket, because that's sort of their first experience with learning the word blanket. And so they just assume that these things have something in common, so they must share something in common with the language as well. And so that's an example of overextension. How do we develop language is another sort of debate versus nature and nurture. Are you born with it, or are you, do you learn it from your environment? And it's always both, but Noam Chomsky believed that we are born with language abilities, and that's evidenced with the overgeneralization and this idea of unique mistakes that they make, that they're not just copying their parents. If it was from nurture, then they wouldn't do overgeneralization. They wouldn't say, I goed to the park. They would just speak correctly. So there must be some sort of nature involved in it that, that's driving them to make those mistakes. But this guy named B.F. Skinner, which we'll talk about more, his ideas of behaviorism, that language is something that you learn because of the consequences to language. So when you copy the parents' language, then they reward you for it. So if your mom's trying to say goodbye, and you say goodbye, she gets super happy and gives you a hug, and you feel rewarded for using that language. And so therefore you're more likely to continue speaking the way that she does, because you are rewarded for it. Now, ultimately, it's both. We're both born with abilities to speak, but also that needs to be nourished in the context that it is important that our environment is rewarding us for the speech that we do make, and maybe punishing us for the mistakes that we that we make with our language, that we are learning from our parents, but at the same time we're built to learn from our parents. And so it's always nature versus nurture. Now, one of the ways that we can see this idea of nature versus nurture is when we have unique case studies that allow us to sort of look at these critical periods of language development. So we've talked about critical periods before. Basically, it's a period in which you need to have certain stimuli, and if you lack that stimuli, it has a large effect on normal development. So you need to have stimulation during certain times of your life in order to have normal development. And that's that critical period. We got critical period for all kinds of stuff as far as socializing and language abilities. But we notice that for language, it seems to be the first 7 years of your life is that critical period. It's a critical window of time that if you do not get exposed to language, you will not learn language nearly as well as someone who was born exposed to a language. So they noticed this with people learning a second language. So acquisition of second language, this is my independent variable here, right? And my dependent variable is the grammar or the proficiency of the person. So native speakers have a high grammar proficiency. At 3 to 7, we still see people who learn a second language between 3 and 7 years old as also having pretty high proficiency. But after about 7, that's when we see it drops off. So if you start learning a second language at about 8 to 10 years old, you'll only get about 75% of the way there that someone who is native to that language would. And 11 to 15, it drops even more. And 17 to 39, it drops even more. So unfortunately, if you're learning a second language right now at the age of 17 or 18 years old, you will never learn that language to proficiency when you're comparing yourself to a native speaker. Now, how do they know this? One of the things is the case studies that they've unfortunately, but also luckily, had the chance to study. And one of the stories is about a girl named Jeannie Wiley. And so she had a horrible childhood where her parents did not teach her language. They treated her basically like a wild animal. They kept her in a room under lock and key, only came in inside and outside of the room to give her some food, and never expressed love, never talked to her, basically treated her like a terrible, not even like a pet, because, normally you would love and hold your pet. They treated her like a caged animal that they didn't care about. Until finally someone found her at about the age of 13, after spending her whole life in this room with no human contact. And she never really did gain full language abilities after that. They tried as hard as they could, but she never really could grasp full grammar proficiency. And so that's another one of those case studies where they really realized that it's those first few years of life that's super important. Now, one of the things they talk about is why. Like, why can't I just learn a language later on in life? Like, I learned lots of stuff later on in life. Why can't I pick up a language? The idea of a critical period is that your brain is born, like we said with Noam Chomsky's idea, with this language acquisition device. So we're not sure how it works, but we just know that when you're born, you've got lots of connections in your brain ready to go. And the environment that you're in allows for those connections to be strengthened. So if you have a connection for language, and then you learn a language, those connections are made stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger, right? But if you don't learn a language, or for example, you're learning a second language later in life, those connections after the age of 7, they start to fall apart. If they're not being used, your brain says, well, if we're not going to use it, why should we waste energy on keeping these connections together? It's called synaptic pruning. And so it's basically your synapses, or the neurons are basically unconnecting. And that's essentially what happens, that after the critical period, your brain has already sort of broken those connections. And so it makes it really difficult for your brain to try and make those connections again. So while your brain has those connections ready, that's essentially the critical period. And you must experience things that exercise that pathway in your brain. And if you don't, then you won't have normal development. So when we look at language and thought, how do we form language, and how do we form it from our thoughts? Or is it the other way? Do our thoughts come from our language? So this is the question of, do we express our thoughts with language, or do we have thoughts because of language? So are you capable of having a thought that you cannot express in language? So is it dependent upon the language that you know? And how does this relate to culture? Are cultures different because they have different languages if the thoughts that they have are dependent upon their language? So it's this sort of really meta way of looking at what is thought. Is thought create language, or does language create thought? And there's not really a solid answer for this, but we do have some evidence to say that yes, thought is influenced by language. Now, the idea here came from a guy who was called Sapir-Whorf, and he came up with an idea that if you don't have language for a particular idea, then you can't have that idea. And so he looked at languages that didn't really have a solid past tense in the grammar structures. And he wanted to know, are they even capable of thinking about the past if they don't have a past tense structure? And if they are able to think about the past, then how does it influence the way they perceive the past? And he looked at this to try to understand what is influencing what. Is it language that influences thought, or thought that influences language? So the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis was basically this idea that you can break down how language influences thought in two basic ways. Now, his original thought was called linguistic determinism. Basically, linguistic determinism says that your language determines what you can think about. Language determines thought. And so different languages have different conceptions of reality because the language is basically controlling thought. Now, it's not really accepted that that's the case, because we know that through other tests that we've done, that languages that don't technically have a past tense still do have a past tense. They just don't use it in the way that English does. They don't have a verb tense for the past, but they might use an adjective that indicates the past. So they still do have this concept of the past, just because they don't have the same structure that other languages do. So we've ruled out linguistic determinism essentially, but there is this other element which is called linguistic relativity, which is basically a watered down version of linguistic determinism. And it says that language influences your thinking. It doesn't determine it, but it influences it. And that also these language differences between cultures can potentially be associated with at least some of the cultural differences in thinking. So here's some examples of this, where we do know that the way that a language is designed influences how people think. It doesn't determine it, but it influences it. So this is a quote from Benjamin Whorf, which says, "Language shapes the way we think and determines what we can think about." It's true to a certain extent. Here's a couple of examples. They did one study to look at Spanish speakers, to look at the specific grammar structure of when accidents happen. So Bobby and Billy are playing with a vase, and maybe one of them drops it. And the idea was that they wanted to test people's memories later to see, could they remember which one of the boys broke the vase? So when you look at this in English, you would assign responsibility to one person. So if I say Billy dropped the vase, I know it was Billy's fault. But in Spanish, with certain grammar structures, of course, you could say, a Billy se le cayó el florero, which means the vase fell from Billy. So the main difference here is that I'm not really assigning blame to Billy. I'm really saying it happened to Billy. And so that was a huge difference in the perception of what happened. And they wanted to know, do people have a difference in their ability to remember who was at fault for doing it? If the language structure doesn't really assign blame, will they remember the blame? And the answer was that Spanish speakers did have a harder time at remembering who was at fault for the accident. And that's probably because of the grammar structure, that the grammar structure influenced the way that they perceived it and the way that they remembered it. So the syntax seemed to have an influence on reality. And that's the crazy part, that the language that they had learned in their brain influenced the way that they saw reality.